Welcome everyone. This is another episode of Candid Craic by Q Lab. We have one special guest and a returning co-host, Richard. How are you, Richard?
I'm very well, Oscar.
And on the other side, we have Karen. Karen, how are you?
I am well, thank you.
Karen, before we start, maybe a quick introduction of yourself.
Let me see. Most important bits first. I'm a wife of 26 years. I've been married, two children that are 24 and 21 back in Australia. And that's probably the big part of my world has been raising these two lovely ladies. And in terms of work, I've been 20 years in the HR and OD industry, working in learning and development, leadership and teaming, and basically just helping organizations develop people strategies and people architecture better.
Fantastic. I think you already kind of introduced a little bit about your background and work. So do you mind to go a little bit deeper into the actual work that you do?
In my current context, I'm Singapore based, and most of the work I do at the moment is leadership and teaming. And particularly, I think, more and more it's about helping leaders navigate the complexities of the dynamics that they're working in. It's a really interesting time for leaders to be showing up in the virtual dynamics, the work from home dynamics, the ways in which we enable teams to work well in this environment. So more and more, that's been the focus of my work. How do we help leaders and teams just get the work done they need to do? And in relation to all of that has been, how do we set ourselves up to find the innovations and the ideas and the growth opportunities that exist going forward? So it's kind of like this two interplays between how do you help teams just do what they've got to do today versus how do you help them think about where they've got to go next. So that's the big part of my day.
So you've obviously got a COVID and a pre-COVID set of challenges. Could you sort of explain or delineate between the two types of challenges? What was this like before COVID, and what other complexities have been added now?
From a business perspective or a personal work perspective?
Either or. I mean, you can do business first and then do personal afterwards.
Okay. Well, the business ones first, I think. There was a huge amount of crisis that kind of hit the system. I think the system was already under pressure anyway, the work dynamics that people were operating in. And I think the COVID landscape just added another round of pressure. And, I saw my business pivot really quickly from, face-to-face training or cohort coaching and that kind of work to actually just helping hold leaders together and actually helping them show up to a pressure cooker that I think a lot of them found in from a personal perspective as well as a work perspective. And a huge amount of that was just dealing with isolation and the feelings of exclusion, and how do you actually help groups come together? We talked so much about psychological safety and building trust and all these things, but I think the reality hit the road in a really hard way through COVID about what some of the practicalities of this actually means. So for me, you're talking about trust and safety when you're doing a face-to-face event is incredibly different to when you start talking about how trust works in a virtual environment. And so to me, that was a big part of the shift, was trying to help bring this narrative out and help leaders just show up each day to an environment that was really tough.
And so what about from the personal perspective?
Yeah, I mean, all my work was face-to-face. So as the same sense of helping leaders deal with this, I kind of went through a same thing of how much did I want to digitize my work? How much disruption did I want to let happen to my own work? So it's been a really tough road in terms of reinventing my own way of doing business. So on one sense, you're helping leaders do that, but in another sense, you're experiencing that in first and foremost. And I know that a lot of my colleagues have kind of felt the same way.
Mm-hmm. And so what kind of struggles? I mean, you're talking about social isolation and trust. I mean, you've almost become a therapist in many senses as well.
There was a big chunk of that happening, and I think if we look at it through the lens of what coaching could be for leaders, like if we were really doing this well, it's less about just achieving a task goal and actually helping people mature and grow. You know, if we're really getting into doing this properly for leaders, then we do end up dealing with a whole of life, all of who they are. You're not just dealing with the piece that shows up at work. And so, yeah, you really did see people, their whole world just smashed together, and they really couldn't separate the home person from the work person, from the social person. And sometimes that created some really big challenges for people to navigate through.
But without naming anybody, I mean, can you explore what that looks like a little bit? You know, what kind of challenges this self, or these versions of self mashed into one?
Yeah.
You know, what kind of challenges did you see emerging from that?
You know, I think we wrap all these words up, but behind them are just such hard stuff. You know, work-life balance is the word we wrap around it. But what I was seeing first and foremost, I think, was people that used to use avenues of compartmentalizing their stress, and suddenly they can't do any of those things because it's all in the one environment. Their environment changed, and so their ways of coping with stress were really brought to the fore. And so, you know, the dynamics where they maybe would go and have a quick coffee with a friend to decompress before the next meeting just didn't exist anymore. It was just back to back to back to back. So where do you start to build in the release valve for the stress? On top of that, a lot of us were then, you know, in lockdown. So even if you could find a way to walk away from your desk, you couldn't go anywhere to remove yourself from the environment. And so home and work and life just suddenly collided. And I think first, you know, we saw stress just explode for people. And it's not that they didn't have strategies. It's just that the strategies were all working in different places. So how do you start to put some of that back together in a meaningful way? So a lot of what I ended up doing was just helping people work through the real basics of stress management. And just the fundamentals of sleeping well and nutrition and hydration, really simple stuff that we know makes a big difference to how we show up cognitively and emotionally at work.
This notion, and there's something I'm really interested in, the notion of role switching, so that the little spaces between the role switching, which you sort of mentioned, the coffee, yeah, or the I'm walking from one meeting to another and I'm doing, that's gone for pretty much everyone. And also you're seeing your partners are seeing the role you play in work, and your children, and et cetera, et cetera. So is that were you almost fulfilling that function of somebody in between space that they could talk to help them switch roles at this kind of rapid pace?
Yeah. And they could schedule a meeting with me and knew it wasn't going to be yet another thing taking from them. The flip side of that is I then had to start saying no to some of that, because I just had people that were scheduling meetings to offload like a therapist, and then I've got nowhere to put that. So I think for people in my industry, this is also something we have to monitor for ourselves, is that, you know, we don't just create spaces for people, but we also create spaces for ourselves. And so we have to practice what we preach. But yeah, and I mean, it's similar to spaces. I call it shifting the gears. And, you know, this kind of gear shift that we would do when we would get the opportunity to go for a walk after a meeting just didn't exist. And so it is about creating new routines and habits that can shift the gears in your head so that you can ramp up for the next thing you need to show up for.
Yeah, I mean, and it I think this was unexpected for lots of people. They felt work from home would be, oh, you know, I can just relax and have my own space. But you're almost talking about the opposite experience, that space became burdensome and troublesome for various people. Was that something that you were seeing, this sort of almost the home space becoming alien to them?
I think in Asia, we saw a collision of space where space is at a premium anyway. And not everybody had somewhere they could go and work and then shut the door on and go away to get back into home world. It was all, and it is still all happening in the one space, in the bedroom, you know, in the family room around the table. And so you're watching everybody have to try and work out what was work and what was home, and how do I manage this world of space? And I remember one of the drinking dialogues during that lockdown period. We had a wonderful woman on from Melbourne, I don't remember her name, who had written an article around creating space, defining space in your home psychologically, so that you had a play space and you had a quiet space, even if they were in the same room, but you created this dynamic that space had a name so that you could just assign it a function.
And sort of contrary to that, because that makes a lot of sense to me, did you find anyone thriving in these conditions that you were talking to that, well, oh, this is amazing? Because a lot of the reporting is, oh, yeah, lots of people are really thriving like this. So
yeah.
did you experience that as well?
Yeah, and I think some personalities, I would in hindsight now, I would certainly say locus of control had a big part to do with that. And I think people who are strongly internally locused worked out, how can I make this work for me, and figured out early on, how do I create my own highs and lows and drive. And I think people who needed more of the dynamic around them and more of the fed off the energy of the group, to kind of define how they were really struggling, because they didn't necessarily have the skill set internally to choose, okay, I'm going to choose how I show up to this. So yeah, I certainly met people that were thriving. And I think senior leaders, there's a number of them, like by and large, you usually get more internally locused people at that level. But they're often looking after people that are not necessarily as internally locused. And I think that's where it became a challenge, is they were having to create dynamics for people as well.
One thing that you mentioned, Karen, was that you were building you had to build new routines and this personal space, because of course you were on calls all the time, but then also you noticed that you kind of had to step back from that. I'm interested in if you can tell a little bit more, what kind of new routines you had to build or develop.
I think it's different for different people, but I think we needed to separate, what potentially was a healthy routine before we were kind of constrained into the pandemic COVID world, and maybe what wasn't helping us. And I think that's the big ticket. So each person's different. I can talk probably from myself. I'm a highly creative person, and so when you put someone in a routine where you can't really find the ways to define those creativity, you start to really feel quite stressed. So I had to work really hard to maybe I cleared my decks for a good couple of months and actually just focused on finding what creativity was going to look like in a pandemic environment. And I really had to do that in order to show up really well to the work that I do, because it's so important to the routine of what feeds energy into me. And so that's one aspect for me, but that was the same for many of the leaders that I was working with. It's about a routine that really helped give them energy and define, what gave them their emotional management they had that was gone. So let's figure out what a routine needs to look like now that can help replace some of that. And so it might not be a whole new routine, but it might just be a reshuffling of routines that they've been doing. Yeah. So exercise is a really big one that most people pick, and we change up the exercise routine because it actually gives us energy. And if we do the same one for long periods of time, it doesn't always work. So, it's the same principle.
What about the personal space that you were trying to create?
Well, we had the ability with the spare room to make some changes and shuffle some things around. So, whereas I would normally have things set aside and get all of my art gear out, we actually set up a whole studio so that I could actually stop and slow down and do that. But for other people, it's sometimes it's about having a box that's got all these things in it that lets them stop and play, or it might be that actually you define a space that when you go into that, you turn all the devices off. It might be a place of stillness where you can actually know that you're not going to have someone come and interrupt you. If I'm sitting on that couch, that's the no interruption couch. Unless the house is burning down, we don't talk to that person. It could be as simple as that.
So it's the stuff you're talking about here is sort of the coping mechanisms for an extreme situation. But I know the actual work you do is a lot around. So you talk about being creative. So you're looking at this internal creativity in organisations or entrepreneurship. That's something that you're interested in, and teaming or perfect teams or this kind of, how do you get a team working well? So I'd quite like to sort of move in that direction. Is how did you deal with these two passions, as they were, or specifics that you work with in how do you deal with them generally, and what do you do generally, but also what's the pandemic done to that kind of work?
Generally, I see these two as two sides of the same coin. I think of innovation as creation and exploitation joined together. And the creation piece, we hear so much, we talk about innovation as a value and innovation as a process, and innovation as a thing that we need to have, and leaders need to be innovative. But innovation really is a mix-up of these two pieces: the capacity to actually generate new ideas and actually forward look, and also the ability to exploit it into actually bring it into the business, embed it in the business, and actually make money off that idea. And so we often find that the problems that we face in teams, or the challenges leaders face, are these two sides. One is, how do we actually find new customer segments or new product or new process, or significantly reinvent the way we're doing it, versus now, how do we actually change processes that have been embedded for a long period of time and that people really don't want to change. And so the teaming is often about that very dynamic. They're very set, or they're very fixed in the way they want to do things. And so how do you get people to throw open the doors and go, maybe we don't need to do it this way anymore? And then the flip side of that is, so now how do you harness new ideas, and how do you even create the space to be able to think? And I've been doing that kind of work for a while. And then when the pandemic hit, the sheer idea of creation of new ideas, we did see some amazing capitalization of invention through that time, particularly like supply chain. And we saw some really interesting ways that people started to see what was coming and capitalize on it. But on the flip side, I think people doubled down on existing processes because, well, everything else is changing, so I'll just lock in the way I've always done it, and I'm not really keen on changing it. And so we just saw people take a wholesale existing processes and just start doing them in a virtual environment, and wonder why that didn't always work. One dynamic I was involved in was getting, something like 20,000 staff to work online that had never worked online. You don't have time to reinvent the processes there. You're just going to take the day-to-day work and reproduce it just in a digital environment. And eventually that's going to have problems, because you just can't run the same amount of traffic at a cognitive level digitally that you were running necessarily face-to-face.
This has given us a rabbit hole to dive down, because there's two distinct questions here. So one is the role of, and we'll go one by one, so I won't talk about the second one until we've answered the first. So one is the role of the crowd or the community or others in creative thinking. The clash of domain knowledge in a creative way. How do you do that now? So is the big question.
Are you thinking open innovation as opposed to closed innovation?
I still think in both you're going to have some kind of domain knowledge clashing. So you're going to have people with different perspectives coming in and saying this. Oh look, this is a new way of thinking about this from this. So now it's virtual, or a lot of it's virtual, and it's all formal meetings.
Yeah.
How does this creative clashing in the entrepreneurial space happen, and how you again lacks and possibilities that you're seeing?
I have to say, I'm not sure we've cracked that nut at all, and I'm not saying it's not that it can't happen, but the challenge we always had pre-pandemic, and if you read any of the research literature around virtual teaming, was always that you could really embed existing processes and even existing learning, but there was a really big challenge in terms of take up of new knowledge, like if we needed people to learn something new or generate new ideas or work in a highly complex collaborative way. It was always a complicated thing. We talked about being able to do it, but really there was no research that was validating that this was working well. And I don't think the pandemic fixed fixed that thinking yet. I think we've still got a long way to go to understand it. But the challenge we've always faced is it takes so long for the brain to be able to take up new ideas or generate new thought. And when we're fixed between sandwiches of meetings, we're really not giving the brain the space to slow down and actually create the new knowledge that's required. And so I think probably the number one thing that we have to do in this hybrid environment that we're in is create space for learning and space for stillness, because that's actually where the new ideas are. And prior to that, people would create these spaces offline. But I think we have to formally create them in a much more deliberate way.
And that nicely links into the second half of the question. So firstly, we don't have these in-between spaces or silent spaces or cross-disciplinary spaces where creativity happens. But secondly, that space is being filled up by something else. And I think you've already talked about it. It's the business as usual kind of work exported into the virtual, which is now just filling up the virtual. So how do you do teamwork in that kind of environment where, what does it look like, and are we gaining anything? Are we losing anything?
Well, I think we're gaining in one sense. I mean, leaders didn't necessarily, unless they worked in an environment where they were forced to run a virtual team, by and large, leaders didn't necessarily have the capabilities just naturally sitting there to just convert to a virtual environment. And I think we've seen a really big learning curve for leaders in terms of how do I manage people virtually? How do I make it work? And I think, that's can only stand us in good stead going forward, because the learnings throughout this time will only add to what a leader's capable of doing. But the teaming piece of it, I think, has continued to be a challenge. And I'm not sure we've fully seen the impact yet of the moving everything to work from home. Now it's a sustained work from home environment in some countries, but not in others. And so what we're seeing are people who are now they've been able to do all the transactional stuff, double down on business as usual, optimize the current business and figure out how to make that work. But that's not where business stays. It's so dynamic and it's so changeable. And so I think now we're starting to see now how do we make this work for the next growth or the next change? And for teams, I think this is getting back to some of the fundamentals of what does trust look like in a virtual environment, because it forms and develops differently to a face-to-face environment. What does psychological safety look like when you're making meaning via pixels and sound bites? What does it mean to actually problem solve something when you can't necessarily stop, pause, make meaning of what someone's saying in such an easy way? And I think they're always the heart of what makes teams work, is getting down to those pieces. Do
you have any ideas as to what might be done?
Well, there's a couple of things we already know that help in terms of like trust. We form trust in a virtual environment. And I know there's a lot of learning still coming out, but by and large, we trust in the work first, and then we trust in the person. And in a face-to-face, we've got the ability to form this trust through body language and making meaning there. So one of the ways that can help teams function better is just to be really explicit about what are the rules of play for how teams are going to operate and how they're going to communicate. Always assuming good intent, because you can't see the body language, and you didn't see the person 5 minutes before that meeting and saw that something happened, or you don't have all that meaning making that your brain's just naturally doing in an environment where you get to see people. So you have to assume good intent, because you're only getting sound bites of things. So it's about setting up a different set of rules, I think, for the brain to say, we're going to be explicit. We're going to have short, sharp bursts of tasks, because they help with being able to see that someone's able to, that person's delivering. So we've got really short, sharp goals that really help make it clear how the team wants to operate and its rhythm. And I think the other big one then is being explicit about work through the trust through the work. Yeah.
So there's rules of engagement. There's this is how we're going to define trust and teamwork within this virtual space, and trust can generate through that. What about vertical trust, so that the leader trusting the team or the team trusting the leader. Are you seeing any interesting things in that space?
We saw a massive rise in micromanagement. Massive rise in
Can
micromanagement.
you give us some examples? Because that's interesting as well.
Someone, I've got an example of a leader that was requiring hourly status updates from all staff and then a daily summary report from every staff member on how they spent their entire day. Yeah. So I think this is a challenge for, if you're used to watching everything and getting feedback in that sense as a leader, this really did throw out the sense of where's my trust? Do I trust only in myself? Do I actually trust my people to do what I've asked them to do? We did see a massive rise in micromanagement. I did hear numerous cases and get asked to sort of, what can we do about? Yeah.
What's that causing in terms of the well-being and the performance of the team? If you're getting this loss of vertical trust, have you got any indications of what's happening there?
Well, we saw people just basically they disengage. We see a huge drop in motivation. You see a huge drop in disengagement. But and that happens in workplaces. But when you put that with isolation and you put that with not being able to maybe debrief with friends or colleagues so easily, you start to see people spiral down into some really not so good headspaces. So I think when you lose trust in your leader to be able to let you just get on with your job, you do see a huge challenge in terms of, well, I'm going to check out of this, and I'm going to, at best, I'm going to just be present and do nothing. At worst, it's absenteeism and exit from the organisation. So you run the risk, if you don't get this vertical trust piece right, of really having a talent management problem that's very expensive to business to solve, but it's also really just bad for people.
So I've got another, before we move away from this, there's another question that's sort of come to mind. So one of our other interviewees in the Candid Craic, Jeff Marlowe, talks about how the teams interpret orders that are not clear, or directives that are not clear. And so so you get a directive from, this is the strategy and this is blah, blah, blah. And then the team all meet together and go, what do you think they meant by that? And do you think it's this or do you think it's that? Has that been lost as well in your experience, this kind of interpretive necessity to make sure that the instructions meet the reality and then the context?
I mean, at easy answer, yes, absolutely, for sure. I think there's a complicated answer to that too, which is, I think a lot of the meaning-making models that we all use to interpret information really have been challenged. And I think this is why creativity and innovation at this point in time, I think we're seeing such an interesting time for it, because the mental models, the cognitive mental models that we make meaning with, really, we have our well-worn patterns and habits of how we think. But when you put that into a virtual environment, when do you just chew the fat to go, what do you think that meant? It just isn't there. Or it might have been in the beginning. People tried to recreate their day onto Zoom, but very quickly it's just become back-to-back meetings. And 10 to 12 to 14 hours of them, because, well, you don't need dinner, do you? You could just jump on that next time zone's group of meetings as well, couldn't you? And so I think that's a big part of where that challenge has come, of making meaning of what leaders and strategy and planning. There just isn't the opportunity to kind of do the way we've done it before. So yeah.
I got one more question again, because you're going further and further down the rabbit hole. So when this is going on, so there's now 14 hours of back-to-back meetings, and it's just from Singapore. We've got people in the States who've been telling us they've been going through the same thing.
Yep.
In my day, I've had days that start at 7 and finish at midnight.
Yep.
My choice, but I get the choice to go to those meetings or not, but many people don't. So one of the interesting things, or one of the things I'm really wondering is, when everyone's talking about productivity going up, is this what they mean? That people are logged onto the system longer, and that's good? And are they understanding the difference between productivity in terms of being logged onto the system and actually getting the work done? Because it's a core question, and I haven't found anyone who's really been able to answer it yet.
I think there was an acceleration that happened through through COVID where people, businesses doubled down on everyone wasn't quite sure what was going to happen. And so there was a doubling down on numbers and business. And some businesses thrived through this and have seen creation, wealth creation and profit creation through and out the other side. Is it sustainable? Some of it's come at the expense of their talent. So you would challenge how sustainable it is in the long run. But yeah, I don't know whether we're looking at good productivity or whether we're just looking at more productivity in the same. Like I talk about, and it's not my model, I'm trying to remember whose model it is, but I talk about innovation. You have the dominant core logic of the business, and that's where all of your existing business and processes sit. And then, your innovation and growth sits in the frontier lands outside of that. And I think what we saw was a doubling down of the core logic of optimizing the existing business. But I don't know how much we saw of businesses genuinely creating good space, good thinking for where the business needs to go next, and whether they're ready for the forethought that's needed as opposed to just oversight of now. So I don't know the answer to that, but I wonder if that productivity is actually future focused or whether it was just optimizing what they already had.
I've got a question for you, Karen, about, you mentioned this a few times about innovation, right? And sort of value creation. And I guess we have to do this in a virtual space at the moment. So have you seen any sort of examples of individuals, companies that have done this quite well now in a virtual space? Because that's been quite a bit of a transition for creative teams, for organizations in general, to go from a physical environment, this sort of by chance meetings and ideas, to a more organized virtual environment.
Yeah, I don't have a company that comes to mind now, except to say that a lot of the teams that have been working in the biomedical space through all of this, very few of them are face-to-face. And it's collaborative. It comes to the point before, Richard, a lot of that's happening in a very open innovation environment. And there was some conscious decisions taken early on to share knowledge, to allow that to happen. And there were businesses and small businesses that were doing this already beforehand. It's just that they were quite specific in their industries. Software development rarely happens with the same group sitting around a table. There's just some fantastic places like in India and other places across Asia where all they do is you send us your stuff and we'll develop it, but we'll work in conjunction with you. And so virtual development of startup ideas and technology, and that's been happening in a virtual environment for a while. But the idea creation part, I don't know of companies yet that have specifically got that whole end-to-end piece. I don't know, Richard, has any come to mind for you?
Yeah, and I don't think so in the current environment. I think that there's a bit of a challenge in the conservatism of business at the moment, and in the West, specifically related to IP laws. They're unwilling to share any of these ideas. So part of perhaps East Asia's growth is a greater willingness to sort of say, hey, let's just, here's all the stuff and everybody gets involved. And that's, I've definitely seen regional differences there.
Yep.
And I'm just wondering if that what might happen out of all of this is a more willingness to share and participate and co-create between organizations, rather than this I own everything kind of thing that's going on. It's possible, and I haven't seen too many indications, but
before all of this hit, it was the future of corporate entrepreneurship. I mean, there was already a big debate about, what's entrepreneurship, what's intrapreneurship, and what was corporate entrepreneurship. And the working definition of corporate entrepreneurship had expanded considerably to include partnerships, co-creation of new ventures with other industries, and all of these sorts of additional things outside of just corporate venturing and corporate spinning off a new product into its own business. So we were already seeing this idea that business, in order for business to genuinely stay competitive and ahead, they were going to have to figure out how to build partnerships that really leverage new knowledge between different industries. And I think, with the rise of partnerships as a business, as talent, like the titles of business, the head of partnerships and things, we're seeing that more and more, that businesses see the value of it. But yeah, I think this is very much a work in progress.
I've got a bit of and this is a bit of a maybe an off-topic question. I'll come back to the topic of innovation, but there's been a lot of discussion about sort of transparency, right, and being more vulnerable. I wonder if we reach a kind of a peak of oversharing, right? Because what you see happening in a lot of, I mean, there's so much information that we have at the moment, and then on top of that, we're also being asked, okay, you need to be more transparent, right? Even there's this fine line between what is personal life, what is work life, especially now in the space that we work in, that there's almost no line anymore.
Yeah.
Whether we are almost asking too much of people, whether we kind of overshare, have we reached that point, or what's your view on that?
Oh, I think everyone should be allowed to have a hidden self. And I think actually asking people to bring and share all of themselves at work, I don't know that that's actually, no, workplaces are notorious for not being healthy enough to know what to do with all of that person without injuring them. So I'm a firm believer in allowing people the ability to keep some of that to themselves, but to choose wisely what you want to bring in, and bring the best of yourself, sure, but know that you get to take all of yourself home and keep some of yourself back. But I think there's a difference between transparency and authenticity. And so being authentic is being clear about for me, it's a leader who is clear about what they stand for and the principles that drive them and the philosophy that drives them and how they show up and their behaviors in alignment with that, versus here's everything you ever want to know about me. Now go figure out what you want to do with that. And to me, there's a difference between the two. And I want leaders to be authentic and to be able to articulate their story and their philosophy and live to that, as opposed to just putting it all out there and then leaving other people to make a meaning necessarily of what that is.
Do you think there's an explosion of immediacy, as it were? This is me, and take it or leave it.
If I was going to write one of those, one title self-help books, it would be the Lost Art of Patience. And I think that to me is a big part of the story, is we've stopped being patient, and I think that's affecting our ability to be curious, and it affects our ability to be creative, and it affects our ability to listen well. And we're so busy filling our time up with stuff that the patience that we need, I really do believe patience is a virtue that I struggle with, I should say. But I think it's a pursuit worth going after, because I think the end of the line of patience is so much learning.
Yeah, there's some wonderful stuff around the difference between the industrial worker and the knowledge worker. In the industrial worker, you can sort of measure every single activity of their job, and the knowledge worker, a lot of it is nothing, idea, nothing, and that nothingness is the patience that you require for the good idea to come.
Yeah.
Or not even the good idea, but this is a different way to solve the problem. So that's and if you're having your entire life virtual Zoom meetings with no space between, as you discussed earlier, it's very difficult to actually have those kind of ideas, and to have those kind of problem solving moments. And likewise, if you don't have control of self and it's just being exploded out of you, and this is me, and there's no deliberation on how you perform and how you act, you're also struggling with the same problem. How do I sit back and reflect and listen and get ready to contribute in a deliberate way? Yeah.
Well, I'll never forget a professor many years ago telling me that it takes, and I have no idea where he got it from, but I'm going to take it as gospel because it sounded really good. It takes 45 minutes of conscious, uninterrupted thought before you're able to generate a new idea. So if the phone rings in that time, the counter starts again. And he said that's that it's 45 minutes of your brain to go back over all the things it already knows and all the bits and pieces that that it's been wandering through before your brain's ready to start the process of new thinking. And, you know, I mean, I can't tell you where that number comes from, but I would say that's pretty accurate from my experience.
It's quite interesting. My PhD supervisor basically said you've got to spend a year meandering before you'll have an idea worth having. And it's, you know, and that 40, yeah, it takes a long time to move into that space where you create something meaningful and innovative. And I've had this asked me on stage. So I was part of a panel talking about creativity and innovation. And of course, the most difficult question from the audience that I've ever had, where they said, well, what have you actually personally done that's creative or innovative? You know, what right do you have to be on stage? Which was, you know, and I was, you know, that part of doing research is, well, it has to be new knowledge. That was a pretty easy answer for me to go for. But some of the others on stage were really quite stumped. Yeah, they could talk about the process of innovation, but they hadn't actually created or innovated something themselves. And then that's I think perhaps one of the challenges with the process as well, that it's so fast. Yeah, this. It's just process-based rather than reflection-based, etc. So really interesting commentary. Yeah,
and I think, you know, we basically, as workplaces, we're giving people 1 or 2 day training program on how to be innovative, or if you're lucky, and then you're expected to just go and, I don't know, be magically able to create or be able to collaborate in a way that produces something new. But really, this is just such a slow built capability that we need to make space for. And it's not something we can just schedule in a Zoom meeting of 30 minutes and then we're going to come up with a new idea.
It seems that you're trying to promote slow innovation here.
Do you know, I don't think innovation is slow. I think it really is fast, but I think we just have to get out of our own way. I mean, we adapt and change so fast, but we put all these constraints and processes and structures around us that inhibit us from just doing what I think comes quite naturally. So, you know, when you actually just ask people to solve a problem and they don't have any of the organizational constraints around, this is not how we do this here. When you take all that away and you give them a theoretical scenario, it's amazing how people show up really quickly. You get values, you get creative, you get solutions, you get ideas, you get out-of-box thinking, you see the human dynamics at play. And then as soon as you overlay the corporate culture on top of it, you see all the reasons why it's not working.
So this cycles me back to the question I asked you about intrapreneurship in a virtual world where you don't have the domain clashes, because yes, the thinking is slow. Yeah. Because when you've got domain clashes, for the clashes to be useful, the people who have the knowledge to be creative, it's taken them a long time to get that knowledge generally. Yeah. But the clash between knowledge is really fast. So when somebody talks about this from one perspective and somebody else says, oh, and that it's like that, and that's what you're trying to create, those moments where someone else goes, oh yes, and then you've got two things coming together. That's when it's fast, and perhaps that's what we're losing.
Oh yeah, definitely. And I think we're trying so hard to mute that energy out of businesses. You know, this is for want of a better term, this is the storming energy. This is the creation, the conflict, the healthy conflict, we talk about this happening in teams and in leaders, but this is that energy. And if as a leader, you're able to harness it and use it in a positive way and really bring it to the fore, it's powerful energy because it is so fast, but you've got to be able to harness it and you've got to be able to then deliver on it to the other side. And I think that's, we keep muting everything down. So everyone's passively listening to everything, instead of actually, going after really great conflict. Because I think diversity and conflict are really powerful things.
So what would you do in organizations to create exactly this? Okay, so the space where ideas can clash at speed.
There's two, I'd answer that in two parts. The first one is I would start getting people really good with dissent. I would make dissent and the capacity to have challenger thinking just normal. And I would say that leaders have to get really good at dissent, which means you need to be able to set some of the power and ego aside, because you don't invite dissent if you want your opinion to be the most important. But dissent to me is like, it should be if we're going to talk about values on walls and the challenge, dissent would be right up there for me, because it's a really good one. But
have you ever seen dissent as a value on a wall? Because I haven't.
No, but gee, I've asked a few companies to do it. They talk about, I reckon it is there. It's just there under different names. You know, we wrap it up under agile and all these sorts of things, but often what that really is the capacity to challenge. And I have seen things like the ability to challenge put up there, but I think dissent and the right to say, I want to do it differently, is something that we should encourage a lot more of. And the other part of that is, you know, how do we encourage it? Is, you know, I talk about a thing called the gang of unusual suspects. I think giving people personas to be able to explore existing problems through different lenses is a really great idea. And I think we need to give people space to, it's almost like trying on identities, to be able to step outside of their current role and set that aside to explore an existing problem. And cross-functionally, this is where the value is actually getting cross-functional teams together, not with a monetary goal at the end that they have to achieve, but with an ideas explosion goal. And then someone else takes it and then figures out how to exploit it and put it back into the business. And so people can come in, have a play, and then leave. Because the whole dynamic of maintaining the current business whilst trying to do the future thinking is actually where a lot of the issue is. It's very hard to do the two at the same time.
So pre-pandemic, how much of this were you seeing, this kind of work?
Yeah, it took up a big chunk of my time. You know, helping divisions, teams, groups who were grappling with, where we're seeing our profit base erode. Okay. So how are we going to actually, that dynamic I was talking before, we can't keep optimizing what we've already got. How are we actually going to go looking for new and different? We talk about it, but it's not working. That was actually probably the best part of my work. And it's slowly getting back to that, where businesses are now starting to have those conversations again, where they're like, okay, we now need to actually really do something different here, or we can't just innovate the technology, because that's what we used to do, is we used to throw technology at an innovation problem, thinking that would solve it. But of course, it doesn't.
One of the things I've been talking to executives about and some of the work I've been doing is the first stage of the pandemic, where you had to suddenly adapt to work from home within about 6 to 8 weeks. There's an awful lot of learning there to do the work that you're wanting to do now. Okay, because you're now realizing that the current just re-injecting business as usual practices is not sustainable. So you've got to almost jump back to what you learned about your people in that first to 6 to 8 weeks and use that to recreate the organization. So that's a consistent argument that I've been making. And is that something that resonates with the work that you would want to do?
Yes, but I also am wondering. It's a really good question, because it fits into this whole idea of high performing teaming for me, because I think crisis teaming produces some really powerful outcomes, because people step outside of the normal rules. The normal rules don't apply, and so we see crisis collaboration and crisis teaming generating really amazing outcomes. And often people sit there and go, well, why can't we do this when we're not in the middle of a crisis? And often because that actually is, you know, the cultural dynamic that you're operating in, and the rules of play in the organization don't normally allow it. But for some organizations that I know went through some pretty profound crisis teaming stuff, you know, if you haven't gone back to that and worked out what is it we had to let go of that let those two divisions work together that have never worked together before, if you can't go back and learn those lessons and make some deep, hard structural changes, then you're just going to find yourself back where you were, doing a hybrid environment of the exact same workplace you had pre the crisis teaming. So yeah, I think that's the implication, is what's crisis teaming and what can you learn from it, but knowing that that's not a state you can stay in all the time.
I think you need someone a bit like Oscar on your team who just goes, yeah, let's try it.
Yep.
So every stupid idea that I ever have, he goes, right, how do we make that happen? Yeah. Without him, we wouldn't be talking together, because he's made it happen. Yeah. So.
And there's the entrepreneurial mindset in one fell swoop. Opportunity pursuit. Let's go.
So I have a slightly different view, or my view on terms of innovation, Karen, that you mentioned. Whether it's almost I think new ideas are always good to have, right? But whether there are almost too many ideas, and the ideas that we have are actually very superficial, right? So, which is a bit of a paradox, but and that sort of ties in with the speed of information that we have available to us. So, so to kind of how do you? Because for me, it's almost more okay. How do I learn to filter out the stuff that I really don't need to think of, right? Because there's more and more to think of, but simultaneously there's only so much I can keep in my brain.
Yeah.
And you said you're a highly creative person, so I just wonder how you actually deal with that.
I can relate wholeheartedly to that. For me personally, I actually have to structure my world so that I have value creation time and then value realization time. And so I deliberately set stuff aside so that I can just create and think, because I have a billion ideas, but then I have to actually do the other part, which is realize those ideas. So I structure my world now, not day by day. It might be like a whole month or a whole couple of months where I'm focused on one particular thing or another, because otherwise I'm a bit hyperactive. If I try and do it all in one day, I'm bouncing between these two dynamics that nothing really ever gets done. It's a flood of information and outputs, but none of it's of the quality that I want. It comes back to stillness for me.
Part of the creativity research suggests in order to have a good idea, you have to have an awful lot of bad ones first.
Yeah.
So part of the ideas are superficial is not actually that much of a problem, because you have to have an awful lot of superficial ideas before you have a decent, concrete, useful one.
But the question is, how do you know it's superficial?
You don't, and I think that's the thing, right? Like what you described to me, I personally think that should be fostered. I don't think that should be squashed at all. And I think if you're worried about how do I do that, well, I think you find people who are happy to help you exercise some of those ideas and test them for you. But people spend half their lives trying to work out how to get a flood of ideas. I think it's a really powerful thing. I have to moderate mine, and I have to moderate it because otherwise it overwhelms me. My brain doesn't stop, and at 2 a.m. in the morning, I'm still thinking about ideas.
Well, so the simple, I wouldn't say this necessarily technique, right? But to me, it's more about stickiness. So that I've got a whole list of ideas, right? And some ideas are literally 5, 6, 7, 8 years old. And if I still think about it after a few years, I think, okay, this is probably something that's still relevant to look into, right? Whereas the other 1,000 of ideas, I probably forget because it's either I realize it's too expensive or some word is just a gimmick. So time in this sort of context is actually for me quite relevant to kind of find that stickiness of an idea. When I talk to people more and more and more, we kind of figure out slowly what seems to work.
It's interesting you say that about stickiness, because one of the things they say about the difference between an intrapreneur and an entrepreneur, and again, this is all stuff that's still evolving in terms of its definitions, but I like the differentiation. And one of the key things is around attitude. So an entrepreneur is, they've got attitudes around ownership of IP, about, the income they can make off it. It's going to make me money, or this is going to be good. And also key is autonomy. They want autonomy of it. Now, they are not major features for an intrapreneur, because an intrapreneur ultimately that all vests with the business. An intrapreneur is about risk. What's my relationship with risk like? And so a lot of the things that as you're talking through your list of things, I'm like, that's the entrepreneurial mindset to me, and to a T, because it's all about how long does it stay with me, and is it mine, and can I own it, and is this my idea, and can I take it somewhere and do something with it, where that still exists in the entrepreneur, but it's most of it vests with the business. And so there's a few different dynamics. So I like it. I think stickiness, you sum it up really well.
In fact, that's a word that Richard is using quite a lot, so I just stole that word. But it's very sticky, that word.
Yeah, I
So
like it.
I kind of want to move on to the last part in it to look a little bit more forward, right? So we spoke quite a lot about entrepreneurship, innovation, entrepreneurship. So if you look sort of forward with what's happening right now, right? So people have been talking about all kinds of different spaces, hybrid spaces, virtual and offline, and something in between. So I'd like to hear your view on that. So do you think is what do you hope that will happen with?
What do I hope will happen, or what do I think? I'm a little bit. I
Well,
am nowhere near as cynical as Richard. I am far more optimistic about life.
I'm a romantic. I don't know why anyone thinks I'm cynical.
well,
I think in the short term, say the next 2 to 3 years, I think it's going to be a really complicated environment for everybody. I think, we're seeing a rush back to nationalism, and we're seeing, some not so great geopolitical stuff that I think is going to impact organizations. And I don't think organizations are going to be exempt from them. And they're already being impacted, because we're seeing, sanctions against this country or that country that's impacting these multinationals that have been driving a lot of the innovation agenda for so long. But we're seeing the rise of a lot of other stuff coming up, where people are challenging these big corporates and are trying to see if they can upset the apple cart. So I think we're going to see a lot more small business that is actually going to continue to push the envelopes. But I do think we're in a really interesting geopolitical world that is going to change the way these multinationals are doing business. So in terms of the innovation agenda, I am watching on with interest, because we've got a lot of problems to solve, big problems that don't have easy answers. And I think corporates are going to play a key role in how they're solved. Climate change is a good example of that. And some of the dynamics like that. We're seeing it with the vaccine rollout globally. How do we make sure that the most vulnerable countries get vaccines, because that's actually key to the more profitable countries being able to open up. So, these are really complicated problems. So I'm hoping there's some big minds that are going to show up to them as well.
I think they potentially are. So I'll prove to you that I'm not totally cynical. Because So I think you've got the two movements. I mean, you've certainly got the bubbling up of out of what's been going on, that we can make a difference. Yeah, from a smaller people within the network society, that there's possibilities of making a difference that exist in the network globalized society that perhaps didn't exist when things were divided. And that perhaps is part of the geopolitical challenge is they don't like this shared power through the networks, and they want to control it within local systems. And that's going to play out one way or the other.
Yep.
But I'm going to be to push you into the final question, which is our $3 trillion question. Sorry, $9 trillion question. Sorry, Oscar, I got the numbers wrong, as I normally do. The $9 trillion question, which is the amount of money we think gets lost through bad business practices, value, uncreated value that could be created. So a lot of what you're talking about is how do you meld together exploration and exploitation of the market. So if your thinking was established as part of the mainstream organizational thinking, what would the future of business look like?
Oh, I think if we could actually have businesses that really got this right, I think the sky's the limit. You talk about what's been lost, but what could be gained? Like, what could be gained if we had an open innovation where knowledge was shared far more freely to allow for genuine creation of new ideas? And I think business could jump and thrive on that. And I would love to see where, the connections and the community that exists within a business isn't so much about the exploitation. That's a natural byproduct of great ideas. So it's not about how do I make that dollar, that target this week. It's about how do we add value back into the system in a meaningful way, new products, new ideas, new systems, new customer service methods, and those sorts of things. And I think, I think we're on the cusp of that kind of stuff actually being a real reality. There's a lot happening that lets you think that we really could be changing the dial in terms of how we actually do business. I just hope it goes in the right direction.
I certainly think that's one possible future, and it's one I'll keep my fingers crossed for.
Like I said, I want to be optimistic, but at the end of the day, you've got a bunch of people that really deserve to go to work each day and do good work. And I think that's the thing for me that has changed, is people are less likely to tolerate workplaces that are purely exploitive. And I think, you know, there's more voices being heard to say this is not okay.
Karen, it was a wonderful conversation. I really appreciate your time for today. Richard as well. And I hope to see you next time.
Yeah, looking forward to it.